still can't sleep through the night without waking up in a cold sweat. It's been 3 months since what happened on that stretch of Highway 101 in Northern California, and I'm only now getting to the point where I can talk about it without my hands shaking. My wife keeps telling me to see someone about it, but how do you explain something like this to a therapist? How do you tell someone that everything you thought you knew about the world changed in one terrifying night? I've been driving long haul for 15 years. Started right after high school when my girlfriend got pregnant and I needed steady work that paid decent. The night shifts never bothered me much. Less traffic, cooler temperatures, and the pay differential made it worth losing sleep during the day. I'd driven that particular route between Sacramento and Portland probably 200 times. Hell, I could probably drive it with my eyes closed. October 15th started like any other shift. I'd grabbed my usual dinner at the truck stop diner, meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and way too much coffee. The waitress there, an older lady who'd been working nights longer than I'd been alive, always made sure my thermos was topped off before I hit the road. The weather was clear, which was a blessing considering how early the fog usually rolled in during fall. My rig was loaded with electronics bound for Portland, nothing too heavy, and the truck was running smooth as silk. The first 4 hours were completely routine. I made good time through the valley, listening to talk radio and old country music. The CB was quiet except for the occasional weather update or speed trap warning. I remember thinking it was going to be one of those boring but profitable runs where nothing interesting happened. Looking back now, I wish it had stayed that way. It was just past midnight when I started climbing into the mountains. The road gets twisty up there, winding through dense forests of redwoods and Douglas fir that block out most of the moonlight. Your headlights become your whole world, and sometimes you can drive for 20 or 30 minutes without seeing another vehicle. It's peaceful in a way, just you and the road, and the steady rumble of the diesel engine. I was about 10 miles north of Garberville when I first saw something in the road ahead. At first, it just looked like a dark mass in my lane, maybe a fallen tree or a large piece of debris. I started slowing down and reached for my flashlight, figuring I'd have to get out and move whatever it was off to the shoulder. Wouldn't be the first time I'd had to clear roadkill or storm damage. As I got closer, my headlights lit up what I initially thought was the biggest deer I'd ever seen, but something about the shape wasn't quite right. The body was too long, too thick through the torso. I pulled up about 50 feet away and put on my hazard lights, then grabbed my flashlight and climbed down from the cab. The October air was cold and sharp, with that smell of wet leaves and pine needles you get in the mountains. My boots crunched on the asphalt as I walked toward what I now realized definitely wasn't a deer. As I got closer, my brain started trying to process what I was seeing, but nothing made sense. The thing was massive, easily 8 feet long from head to toe. It was lying on its side with its back to me, covered in what looked like dark, matted fur. The body was humanoid, but wrong. Too big, too muscular, with proportions that didn't match anything I'd ever seen. The arms were incredibly long, extending well past where the knees would be on a person. And the hands were enormous, easily twice the size of mine, with fingers that looked almost human but too long and thick. I circled around to get a better look, keeping my distance and playing my flashlight beam over the creature. When I saw the face, my legs almost gave out. It was like looking at something that was part human and part something else entirely. The features were definitely hominid. 2 eyes, a nose, a mouth. But everything was wrong. The brow ridge protruded like a shelf over deep-set eyes. The jaw was massive and jutting, filled with teeth that were too big and too sharp. The skull was elongated and came to almost a point at the top. But it was the feet that really drove home that this wasn't any animal I'd ever heard of. They were massive, probably 18 or 20 inches long, with toes that looked almost like fingers. The skin on the soles was thick and leathery, covered in calluses that spoke of a lifetime walking on rough terrain. I stood there for what felt like an hour, but was probably only a few minutes, just trying to process what I was looking at. The smell hit me then, a musky animal odor mixed with something else I couldn't place. It wasn't the smell of decay or death, just a wild, primitive scent that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The creature had obviously been hit by a vehicle, probably a big rig like mine from the look of the damage. There was massive trauma to the chest and abdomen, and one of the arms was bent at an unnatural angle. Dark blood had pooled on the asphalt underneath the body. I remember thinking that whatever had hit this thing must have been going pretty fast. The driver probably never even saw it until it was too late. I was so focused on examining the body that I almost didn't hear the sounds coming from the tree line. At first, it was just a rustling in the underbrush, like a large animal moving through the forest. But then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A low, mournful sound that was almost like crying but deeper, more guttural. It was coming from multiple directions. I spun around, playing my flashlight beam across the edge of the forest, but I couldn't see anything beyond the first few trees. The sounds were getting louder, closer. There was definitely more than one of whatever was making those noises. I heard heavy footsteps, branches breaking, and what sounded almost like voices having a conversation in some language I'd never heard. That's when it hit me. This thing on the road wasn't alone. There were others out there in the darkness, and they were coming to investigate what had happened to their friend or family member or whatever this creature was to them. I started backing toward my truck, trying to keep the flashlight beam moving between the tree line and the body on the road. The sounds were getting much closer now, and I could hear what sounded like large bodies moving through the underbrush with surprising stealth. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get back in that cab and drive away as fast as possible. I was about halfway back to my truck when they emerged from the trees. The first one stepped out of the forest like something from a nightmare. It was even bigger than the one on the road, probably close to 9 feet tall, covered in dark hair that seemed to absorb my flashlight beam. It moved upright on 2 legs, but with a fluid, animal grace that was completely unnatural. Its eyes reflected my light like a cat's, glowing with an intelligence that was unmistakably aware. Then another one appeared, and another. Within seconds, there were 6 of them standing at the edge of the tree line, all focused on the body in the road. The largest one, which I assumed was some kind of leader or alpha, made a sound that was part growl, part moan. The others responded with similar vocalizations, and I realized I was listening to some kind of communication between them. I froze completely, not daring to move or make a sound. I was caught in the open between my truck and the forest, with nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. These things were easily 3 times my size and probably 10 times as strong. If they decided I was a threat, I'd be dead before I could take 2 steps. The largest one started moving toward the body, and the others followed. They moved in a way that was almost ceremonial, slow and deliberate. When they reached their fallen companion, the behavior I witnessed was unlike anything I've ever seen from wild animals. They arranged themselves in a circle around the body, with the largest one at what I guess you'd call the head. One by one, they reached down and touched the dead creature, some placing their massive hands on its chest, others stroking its face or limbs. The sounds they made were heartbreaking, low, mournful cries that were unmistakably expressions of grief. I watched as 2 of the smaller ones, though still huge compared to me, began gathering branches and debris from the roadside. They piled these materials around and under the body with what looked like practiced precision. It was clearly some kind of funeral ritual performed by beings that were supposed to be nothing more than legend. The whole time this was happening, I remained perfectly still about 30 feet away. I don't think they'd noticed me yet, or if they had, they were too focused on their deceased companion to care about my presence. But I knew that could change at any second. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, they finished their preparations. The body was now surrounded by a neat arrangement of branches, leaves, and what looked like flowers or berries. The largest creature stood and made a series of sounds that were clearly some kind of speech or prayer. The others responded in unison, their voices echoing through the mountains in a harmony that was both beautiful and terrifying. Then, one of the smaller ones turned and looked directly at me. Its eyes locked onto mine across the distance, and I felt like I was looking into the face of something that was almost human but fundamentally alien. There was intelligence there, awareness, and something else. Curiosity maybe, or assessment. It made a low sound, not aggressive, but definitely communicative, and the others turned to look at me as well. I've never been so terrified in my life. Every muscle in my body was screaming at me to run, but I knew that would be the worst thing I could do. These creatures could probably outrun a horse, and I was a middle-aged truck driver who smoked too much and didn't get enough exercise. The largest one took a step toward me, and I nearly lost control of my bladder. But instead of attacking, it did something completely unexpected. It held up one massive hand in what looked unmistakably like a gesture of peace or greeting. The palm was easily the size of a dinner plate, with fingers that could probably crush my skull without effort. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I slowly raised my own hand in response. The creature tilted its head slightly, studying me with those glowing eyes. For a moment that stretched into eternity, we just looked at each other across that dark highway. Two intelligent beings from completely different worlds, sharing a moment of mutual recognition. But then something changed. The creatures began making agitated sounds to each other, a series of grunts and growls that seemed almost like an argument. Two of the larger ones started moving toward me with deliberate steps, and I could see in their posture that the peaceful moment was over. Whatever they had decided about me, it wasn't good. I turned to run back to my truck, but I was too slow and too far away. The first creature reached me before I'd made it even 10 feet. A massive hand grabbed my shoulder with enough force to lift me clean off the ground. I tried to struggle, but it was like fighting against a mechanical crane. The creature's grip was impossibly strong but careful. It could have crushed my shoulder blade without effort, but instead it just held me firmly in place. The others surrounded me quickly, and I found myself being carried bodily toward the tree line. My feet weren't even touching the ground. I tried to shout, but terror had closed my throat completely. All I could manage were small, choked sounds that were swallowed up by the forest. They moved through the trees with a speed and silence that was terrifying. Branches that would have torn me apart barely brushed against them. They navigated fallen logs and steep terrain like it was level ground, carrying me along as if I weighed nothing. The darkness was complete under the canopy. I couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction, but they moved with the confidence of beings who knew every inch of their territory. After what felt like miles, but was probably only a few hundred yards, we emerged into a clearing lit by moonlight filtering through a break in the canopy. What I saw there made my already racing heart nearly stop entirely. It was some kind of camp or settlement. Crude shelters made from woven branches and bark dotted the clearing, each one large enough to house creatures of their immense size. Fire pits made from arranged stones held the smoldering remains of recent blazes. Animal hides were stretched on wooden frames, and I could see tools, primitive but clearly crafted with intelligence, scattered around the area. But it was the other creatures that really drove home how much trouble I was in. There had to be 20 or 30 of them in the clearing, ranging from the massive adults I'd already encountered to smaller ones that might have been adolescents or females. They all turned to stare as my captors carried me into their midst. The sounds they made were unlike anything I'd ever heard. Deep, resonant calls that seemed to echo in my chest. Some of them approached for a closer look, and I could smell that wild, musky odor even stronger now. Their eyes reflected the moonlight as they studied me with obvious curiosity and what looked like concern. My captors carried me to the center of the clearing, where they set me down near what appeared to be the largest of the fire pits. The stones around it were arranged in a perfect circle, and I could see bones scattered in the cold ashes. Some looked like they might have come from deer or other forest animals, but others were too large to identify. The largest creature from the road, the one who had gestured peacefully to me earlier, approached and squatted down to my level. Up close, its size was even more overwhelming. Its shoulders were easily 3 feet across, and its arms were so long they nearly touched the ground, even in this crouched position. But it was the intelligence in its eyes that was most unsettling. This wasn't a dumb animal. This was a thinking being with its own agenda. It made a series of soft sounds, almost like it was trying to communicate with me. When I didn't respond, I was too terrified to do anything but stare. It reached out one massive hand toward my face. I flinched away, but there was nowhere to go. The hand was incredibly gentle, barely touching my cheek with one enormous finger. It was like being examined by someone trying to understand what I was. Other creatures gathered around us in a circle, all making those low, rumbling sounds. I realized they were having some kind of discussion about me, though I couldn't understand a word of it. Some of them sounded agitated, others curious, and a few seemed almost protective. Whatever they were deciding, my fate was completely in their hands. The examination continued for what felt like hours. They touched my clothes, apparently fascinated by the synthetic materials. One of them carefully removed my work boots, studying them with obvious puzzlement before setting them aside. They seemed particularly interested in my flashlight, turning it over in their massive hands and making excited sounds when one of them accidentally activated the switch. But through it all, they were surprisingly gentle. Despite their enormous size and obvious strength, they handled me like I was made of glass. Even when their curiosity led them to lift me up to get a better look, they were careful not to squeeze too hard or move too quickly. As the night wore on, I began to realize that I wasn't in immediate danger of being killed. These creatures were clearly intelligent, and they seemed more curious about me than hostile. But I was still their prisoner, and I had no idea what they ultimately planned to do with me. Some of the smaller creatures, I assumed they were juveniles, kept approaching for closer looks, only to be gently shooed away by the adults. They made softer, higher-pitched sounds that almost reminded me of children's voices. One of them reached out to touch my hair with obvious fascination, and I could see the family resemblance in its facial features to the larger adults. As dawn began to approach, I could see the creatures becoming more agitated. They seemed to have some kind of internal schedule that was telling them it was time to move or hide. Several of them began gathering up tools and other belongings, while others started dismantling some of the temporary shelters. It was clear they were preparing to leave the clearing, and I was going with them whether I wanted to or not. The journey that followed was like something from a nightmare. They moved deeper into the mountains, following paths that weren't really paths, just slight clearings between the trees that they navigated with perfect confidence. I was carried most of the way, passed from one creature to another when my current bearer got tired. We traveled for hours, stopping occasionally at natural clearings where they would rest and drink from mountain streams. During these breaks, they would set me down, but always kept me surrounded. There was no possibility of escape. Even if I could have outrun them, which I couldn't, I was completely lost in wilderness that I didn't recognize. The terrain got steeper and more rugged as we climbed higher into the mountains. we passed through groves of ancient trees that must have been hundreds of years old, their trunks so massive that several creatures holding hands couldn't have reached around them. We crossed streams on fallen logs that served as natural bridges and navigated through boulder fields where my captors moved with an agility that seemed impossible for beings their size. At one point, we came to what looked like a sheer cliff face, and I thought our journey had reached an impassable obstacle. But the creatures knew about a hidden path that wound up through cracks in the rock, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. They carried me up this treacherous route with sure-footed confidence, while I closed my eyes and tried not to think about the drop below. By midday, we had reached what appeared to be their permanent settlement. It was hidden in a box canyon high in the mountains, surrounded by towering rock walls that would be invisible from aircraft and inaccessible to any human who didn't know the secret route we had just taken. The settlement was much larger than the temporary camp where I'd first been taken. Stone and wood structures were built into the canyon walls themselves, providing natural shelter and camouflage. Gardens of wild plants were carefully tended in clearings, and I could see evidence of sophisticated tool making and food preparation. But what struck me most was how organized and social the community was. Creatures of different sizes and ages moved through the settlement with obvious purpose. Some tended to the young ones, others worked on various crafts or maintenance tasks. There was a clear hierarchy and division of labor that spoke of a complex culture. They brought me to a structure near the center of the settlement, a kind of council chamber built into a natural cave in the canyon wall. Inside, the walls were decorated with what looked like primitive artwork, handprints, animal figures, and abstract designs that clearly held meaning for their culture. Several of the largest and oldest-looking creatures were waiting inside, and it was clear this was some kind of leadership council. They examined me thoroughly, making those deep, rumbling sounds in what was obviously a serious discussion. I sat in the center of their circle, trying to remain calm while they decided my fate. The conversation went on for a long time, with different creatures apparently arguing for different courses of action. Some sounded angry or agitated, while others were calmer and seemed to be counseling patience. At several points, the creature who had first gestured peacefully to me on the road spoke up, and the others listened with obvious respect. Eventually, the discussion seemed to reach some kind of resolution. The council members made formal-sounding declarations, and the creature who had been advocating for me approached and made what looked like a gesture of protection or guardianship over me. I was led to a smaller chamber that had clearly been prepared for my use. It contained what looked like a bed made from soft pine boughs and animal hides, a basin of fresh water, and even some kind of primitive toilet facility. They had obviously thought carefully about my needs as a human captive. Over the next day and night, for that's how long they kept me there, I was treated more like a guest than a prisoner. They brought me food, fruits, nuts, and what tasted like roasted roots. That was surprisingly palatable. They seemed genuinely concerned about my comfort and well-being. But I also realized that I was being studied as much as cared for. Different creatures would visit my chamber throughout the day, observing my behavior and reactions. They seemed particularly interested in how I used the tools they provided. A wooden bowl for water, simple utensils for eating. They watched intently as I performed basic human functions like washing my face or combing my hair with my fingers. It was clear that I was the first human they had encountered up close, and they were trying to understand what I was and how I functioned. In return, I was learning things about them that no human had ever known. I observed that they had a complex language with different tones and inflections that conveyed different meanings. They had individual names for each other, or at least individual sounds that they responded to. They showed genuine affection for their young, and I witnessed what looked like games and play behavior among the juveniles. But as fascinating as it all was, I never forgot that I was a prisoner. These creatures were intelligent and generally benevolent, but I was completely at their mercy. If they decided I was a threat to their security, or if they simply got tired of studying me, I could disappear without a trace into these mountains. By the second evening, I could sense a change in the atmosphere of the settlement. There seemed to be some kind of debate going on about what to do with me long term. Some creatures appeared to want to keep me permanently, while others clearly thought I should be released. The discussions were more heated now, with obvious disagreement among the leadership. That night, as I lay on my bed of pine boughs, staring up at the stars visible through a gap in the canyon wall, I made my decision. I couldn't wait for them to decide my fate. I had to try to escape, even though the odds of success were virtually zero. I waited until the settlement grew quiet in the deepest part of the night. The creatures seemed to sleep just like humans, though some of them snored with sounds that rumbled through the canyon like distant thunder. Moving as quietly as possible, I slipped out of my chamber and began making my way toward what I hoped was the path we had used to enter the canyon. The settlement was eerily beautiful in the moonlight. The stone structures seemed to glow with a silvery light, and the gardens rustled softly in the mountain breeze. I could see sleeping forms in various shelters, and I held my breath each time I passed near one of them. I made it almost to the canyon entrance before I was discovered. One of the younger creatures, not quite adult but much larger than me, was apparently returning from some kind of night activity. When it spotted me creeping through the shadows, it made a soft sound of surprise, and I froze like a deer in headlights. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then it opened its mouth and let out a booming call that echoed off the canyon walls and woke the entire settlement. Within seconds, the canyon erupted with activity. Creatures poured out of their shelters, all making agitated sounds as they realized their human captive was trying to escape. I ran for the canyon entrance, but several large adults were already moving to block my path. I managed to reach the beginning of the trail that led down from the canyon, but I knew I'd never make it down the treacherous route in the dark while being pursued. Instead, I did something desperate and probably stupid. I left the trail and started scrambling up the steep canyon wall, hoping to find another way out. The rock face was nearly vertical, but there were enough handholds and ledges to make progress possible. I climbed frantically, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Below me, I could hear the creatures organizing some kind of pursuit, their voices echoing off the canyon walls. I made it about 50 feet up before the first of my pursuers reached the base of the cliff. These creatures were incredible climbers. What had been a desperate struggle for me was easy movement for them. They came up the rock face like it was a ladder, gaining on me quickly despite my head start. The first one reached me just as I was trying to navigate around a particularly difficult overhang. A massive hand closed around my ankle with enough force to stop my upward progress completely. I looked down to see one of the largest creatures hanging easily from the rock face with one hand while holding me with the other. For a moment, I thought that was it. I was caught, and this time they probably wouldn't be so gentle with me. But then something unexpected happened. Instead of dragging me back down, the creature made a series of urgent sounds toward the canyon below. I followed its gaze and saw what had alarmed it. Other creatures were gathered at the base of the cliff, but they weren't looking up at us. They were looking toward the canyon entrance, and they seemed agitated about something else entirely. I could hear sounds coming from outside the canyon, mechanical sounds that didn't belong in this wilderness. Then I heard something that made my heart leap, the distant sound of a helicopter. The creature holding my ankle made a decision. Instead of dragging me back to the settlement, it began moving laterally across the cliff face, carrying me with it toward what looked like a narrow ledge about 20 feet away. Its climbing ability was phenomenal. It moved across that near vertical surface as easily as walking across level ground, even while supporting my full weight. We reached the ledge just as the helicopter sounds grew louder. The creature pressed both of us back against the rock wall, clearly trying to avoid being seen from above. I realized that these beings were just as worried about being discovered by humans as I was about being kept captive by them. The helicopter passed overhead, its searchlight sweeping across the canyon. From our position on the ledge, I could see the aircraft clearly. It was a search and rescue chopper, probably looking for me. My abandoned truck on the highway must have been discovered, triggering a search effort. The creature holding me made soft, urgent sounds, and I understood that it was asking me to remain quiet and hidden. As much as I wanted to signal the helicopter, I realized that discovery would probably mean disaster for this entire community of beings. Whatever they were, they had existed in secret for thousands of years, and my rescue might lead to their exposure and destruction. So I stayed quiet and pressed back against the rock wall, watching the helicopter complete its search pattern and disappear over the far ridge. Only then did the creature relax and begin making its way back toward the canyon floor, still carrying me with careful precision. When we reached the bottom, the entire settlement was in chaos. Creatures were rapidly packing their belongings and preparing to evacuate. It was clear that the helicopter's appearance had convinced them that their hidden refuge was no longer safe. The leadership council gathered quickly around us, and there was a rapid, heated discussion about what to do next. I couldn't understand their language, but their gestures and tones made it clear that they were debating whether to take me with them or leave me behind. The creature who had advocated for me from the beginning spoke up again, making what sounded like an impassioned argument. Several others joined in, and gradually the tone of the discussion shifted from heated debate to reluctant agreement. They had decided to let me go, but first they had to ensure their own safety. The entire settlement was packed up with incredible efficiency, and within an hour the canyon looked almost empty. Any evidence of their long-term habitation was either removed or carefully concealed. It was like watching a magic trick, an entire civilization disappearing without a trace. My original captor, the large creature who had first peacefully gestured to me on the highway, approached me one final time. It looked directly into my eyes with that unsettling intelligence, then made a series of careful sounds that felt almost like speech. I couldn't understand the words, but the meaning was unmistakable. This was both a farewell and a warning. Then it did something that surprised me. It reached into what I can only describe as a pouch or bag made from woven plant fibers and pulled out something small. It was a carved piece of wood about the size of my thumb, depicting what looked like a stylized human figure. The carving was primitive but skillfully made, clearly the work of intelligent hands. The creature pressed this token into my palm, then stepped back and made that peaceful gesture again, the raised hand that had been our first real communication. I raised my own hand in response, and for a moment we stood there in mutual recognition and respect. Then, as quickly as they had appeared in my life, they were gone. The creatures melted away into the mountain wilderness, leaving me alone in the empty canyon with just the wooden carving as proof that any of this had really happened. I made my way down the treacherous trail in broad daylight, a journey that took most of the morning. When I finally reached the forest floor, I was exhausted, dehydrated, and completely disoriented. But I was alive and free, carrying with me the most extraordinary secret of my life. Finding my way back to civilization took another full day of walking. I followed streams downhill, reasoning that they would eventually lead to larger waterways and human settlements. By the time I stumbled out of the forest onto a logging road, I was nearly delirious from exhaustion and exposure. The logging crew that found me called for medical assistance, and I was taken to a hospital where I was treated for dehydration, exposure, and various cuts and bruises from my time in the wilderness. The official story was that I had suffered a breakdown, abandoned my truck, and gotten lost in the mountains. The search and rescue teams had been looking for me for 3 days. I never told anyone what had really happened during those 3 days. How could I? Who would believe that I had been captured by a community of Sasquatches, treated as both prisoner and honored guest, and then released with a token of their respect? The story was too incredible, too far outside normal human experience. But I kept the wooden carving, and I still have it today. Sometimes I take it out and examine the careful craftsmanship, remembering those intelligent eyes and that moment of mutual recognition between two very different forms of consciousness. The experience changed me in ways I'm still discovering. I learned that the world is far stranger and more wonderful than most people imagine, that intelligence and culture could take forms we don't recognize or understand. I learned that there are still mysteries in the wild places of the earth, still discoveries waiting for those who are observant enough and lucky enough to encounter them. Most importantly, I learned that we humans aren't alone on this planet. We share it with other intelligent beings who have their own societies, their own customs, their own ways of understanding the world. They've learned to avoid us, probably for good reasons, but they're still there, living their lives in the hidden places beyond our normal experience. And sometimes, very rarely, the barriers between our worlds become permeable, and we catch a glimpse of something extraordinary. I stood there in the middle of that empty highway for another 10 minutes, just listening to my heart pound and trying to convince myself that what I'd just witnessed had actually happened. The forest was completely silent now, as if every living thing was holding its breath. Finally, I forced myself to walk back to my truck. My legs were shaking so badly I could barely climb into the cab. I sat there for a long time before I could even bring myself to start the engine. When I finally did, I drove the rest of the way to Portland, in a daze, my mind trying to process what I'd experienced. I didn't tell anyone about it at first. How could I? Who would believe that I'd stumbled onto a group of Sasquatches performing funeral rites for their dead? I'd seen the looks people give truckers who claim to have seen UFOs or Bigfoot. They think we're just lonely guys who've spent too much time alone on the road making up stories for attention. But this was real. I know it was real. I can still smell that musky, wild odor. I can still see those intelligent eyes studying me in my flashlight beam. I can still hear those mournful cries echoing through the mountains. The first person I told was my wife about a week after it happened. She listened to the whole story without interrupting, then sat quietly for a long time before she spoke. "Honey," she said, "I've known you for 20 years. You're the most practical, down-to-earth man I've ever met. You don't make up stories, and you don't see things that aren't there. If you say this happened, then it happened." That simple acceptance meant more to me than I can express. It gave me the courage to start talking about it with a few other people, carefully and only with folks I trusted completely. The reaction was mixed. Some people were fascinated and wanted to know every detail. Others clearly thought I'd had some kind of breakdown or hallucination. A few suggested I'd been the victim of an elaborate hoax, though they could never explain how anyone could have pulled off something so complex and convincing in the middle of nowhere at midnight. I started driving different routes after that, avoiding that stretch of Highway 101 whenever possible. It wasn't that I was afraid exactly. The creatures I'd encountered hadn't shown any aggression toward me, but the experience had changed something fundamental about how I saw the world, and I wasn't ready to risk another encounter that might challenge my understanding even further. About 6 weeks after the incident, I did drive that route again. It was unavoidable due to construction on the alternate highway. I was tense the entire time, especially when I reached the spot where everything had happened. I pulled over and got out with my flashlight, examining the asphalt carefully. The bloodstain was gone, probably washed away by rain or covered by the sand and grit that accumulates on mountain highways. But there were marks in the dirt at the shoulder that looked like they could have been footprints. Large, broad impressions that were too big to be human and wrong shape to be from any known animal. I also found something else that made my hands shake. Woven into the branches of a small tree at the edge of the forest was what looked like a crude bracelet or ornament made from plant fibers and small stones. It hadn't been there before. I would have noticed it during my initial examination of the scene. Someone or something had placed it there deliberately. I left it alone and got back in my truck. I had no desire to take anything from that place or to disturb what might be some kind of memorial marker. My wife says I've changed since that night, become more thoughtful and less talkative. She's probably right. It's hard to get excited about football games and office politics when you've seen proof that the world is far stranger and more wonderful than most people imagine. I've also become more aware of the forests when I'm driving through them. I find myself scanning the tree lines, not looking for anything in particular, but just acknowledging that there might be eyes watching me from the shadows. It's not a frightening feeling exactly, more like a sense of shared presence in a world that's bigger than either of us fully understand. I still don't talk about my experience very often. Most people aren't ready to hear it, and I've learned to recognize the signs, the polite skepticism, the subtle suggestions that I might have been tired or stressed, the way conversations get steered toward more conventional topics. But occasionally, I meet someone who's ready to listen with an open mind. Usually, they're people who spend a lot of time outdoors, who've learned to pay attention to the subtle signs and sounds of the wild. They understand that nature holds mysteries that science hasn't yet explained, and they're willing to consider possibilities that don't fit neatly into our current understanding of the world. To those people, I tell my story exactly as it happened. I describe the creature on the road, the funeral ceremony I witnessed, the moment of recognition between myself and that massive, intelligent being. I try to convey not just what I saw, but what I felt, the awe, the terror, the profound sense that I was witnessing something sacred and ancient. I don't try to convince anyone that what I experienced was real. I just tell my story and let people draw their own conclusions. Some dismiss it as imagination or hallucination. Others nod thoughtfully and share their own unexplained experiences. A few ask detailed questions, clearly trying to reconcile what I'm telling them with their own understanding of what's possible in the world. The one thing I always emphasize is that these creatures, whatever they are, showed no aggression toward me. They could have easily harmed me if they had wanted to, but they chose not to. Instead, they allowed me to witness something intensely personal and meaningful in their culture. In a strange way, it was an honor. I think about that night often, especially when I'm driving through remote mountain passes in the dark. Part of me hopes I'll never have another encounter like it. The fear and confusion were almost overwhelming, and I'm not sure I could handle going through that again. But part of me also hopes that someday I might see those glowing eyes watching me from the forest edge again. Not because I want to prove anything to skeptics or because I'm looking for another adrenaline rush, but because the encounter changed my understanding of what's possible in this world. It showed me that intelligence and emotion aren't limited to humans, that there are other forms of consciousness sharing this planet with us. It reminded me that despite all our technology and scientific knowledge, there are still mysteries in the wild places of the world, still discoveries waiting to be made by those who are observant enough and lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time. Most importantly, it taught me that the world is far more complex and wonderful than I had ever imagined. In our rush to categorize and explain everything, we sometimes forget that there's still room for wonder, still space for the unknown to surprise us. I don't know if I'll ever see one of those creatures again. I don't know if anyone will ever be able to prove their existence to the satisfaction of mainstream science. But I know what I experienced that night on Highway 101, and I know it was real. And sometimes, when I'm driving through the mountains in the dark, I roll down my windows and listen carefully to the sounds of the forest. Most of the time, I hear only the normal sounds of the night. Owls calling, small animals moving through the underbrush, the whisper of wind through the trees. But occasionally, just occasionally, I think I hear something else. A sound that might be a large creature moving carefully through the darkness, or voices speaking in a language that predates human civilization. When that happens, I drive a little slower and pay a little more attention to the shadows between the trees. Because I know now that we're not alone out here. There are others sharing these ancient forests, living their own lives and following their own customs. They've learned to avoid us, but they're still there, watching and waiting and maintaining their own mysterious culture in the hidden places of the world. And maybe, just maybe, they remember that cold October night when a human trucker witnessed their grief and showed them the respect they deserved. Maybe in their own stories, told around fires and caves deep in the mountains, they speak of the small, strange creature who stood quietly and let them mourn their dead in peace. I hope so, because that night changed me forever, and I'd like to think it meant something to them as well. The highway stretches out ahead of me now, the same endless ribbon of asphalt I've been traveling for 15 years. But it's different now. Every mile through forest country is a reminder that this world is fuller and stranger than we know. Every dark stretch of road is a possibility, a door that might open onto mysteries we've barely begun to imagine. And I wouldn't have it any other way. I'm not the kind of guy who believes in monsters. Hell, I've been hunting these mountains for 20 years, and the biggest thing I ever worried about was a black bear, or maybe getting lost in a whiteout. But what happened to me and my buddies last November changed everything. I'm telling this story because people need to know what's really out there in the deep woods. The official report says it was a bear attack, but that's bullshit. Bears don't plan. Bears don't hunt humans like we're prey. And bears sure as hell don't seal you in a cave to die. Me, Ken, and Bobby had been hunting together every season for the past 8 years. We weren't trophy hunters or anything fancy like that. Just 3 guys who like getting away from our wives for a long weekend, drinking beer around a campfire, and maybe bringing home some venison if we got lucky. Ken was the tracker of our group. That man could follow a deer trail through solid rock if you gave him enough time. Bobby was our cook and camp manager. He packed enough food to feed an army and somehow always remembered the things the rest of us forgot. Extra batteries, first aid kit, that kind of stuff. We'd picked a spot about 12 miles into the Monongahela National Forest, way past where most hunters bother to go. The area was thick with oak and maple, perfect deer habitat, and far enough from the main trails that we wouldn't have to deal with weekend warriors taking pot shots at anything that moved. Ken had scouted it the previous spring and found plenty of sign, rubs, scrapes, well-worn paths heading to water. We drove up Friday morning in Ken's pickup, bouncing along Forest Service roads that got narrower and rougher with every mile. When the road finally ended at a small clearing, we loaded our packs and hiked another 3 miles to our campsite. It was a nice spot, a flat area beside a creek sheltered by big trees with good sight lines in case something wandered through. Setting up camp took most of the afternoon. We pitched our tents in a triangle around the fire pit, hung our food high in the trees to keep the bears away, and tested our radios to make sure they worked. The weather was perfect, cool and crisp, with hardly any wind. Ken found fresh deer sign within 100 yards of camp, so we were feeling confident about our chances. That first evening was exactly what we had hoped for. We grilled some steaks Bobby had brought, opened a few beers, and planned our strategy for the morning. Ken wanted to work the ridge to the north, where he had seen the most sign. Bobby and I would take the valley bottom, following the creek downstream to a meadow about a mile away. We'd meet back at camp by noon to compare notes. Around midnight, I woke up needing to take a leak. The fire had burned down to coals, and the forest was dead quiet except for the creek babbling nearby. I stepped outside my tent and walked about 20 feet into the trees. As I was finishing up, I heard something that made me freeze. A low grunt, like a pig, but deeper. It seemed to come from across the creek, maybe 50 yards away. I listened for another minute, but didn't hear it again. Bears make all kinds of weird noises, so I figured that's what it was and went back to bed. We were up before dawn, coffee brewing over the camp stove while we loaded our rifles and checked our gear. The morning was cold enough that our breath steamed, but once we started moving, we warmed up quickly. Ken headed up the ridge while Bobby and I followed the creek. The plan was simple: move slowly, glass the open areas, and try to spot something before it spotted us. For the first few hours, everything went according to plan. We found plenty of deer sign, tracks in the mud by the water, fresh droppings, places where they'd been browsing on young saplings. Bobby even spotted a small doe around 10 in the morning, but she was too small and too far away for a clean shot. We let her walk. Around noon, we were heading back toward camp when Bobby stopped dead in his tracks. He was staring down at something in the mud beside the creek. When I caught up to him, I saw what had gotten his attention. A footprint, clear as day in the soft earth. But it wasn't from a deer or a bear or anything else I recognized. The print was huge, maybe 18 inches long and 8 inches wide, with 5 distinct toe marks. It looked almost human, except no human foot is that big. The toes were thick and spread out, like whoever made it was used to walking on rough ground without shoes. The print was deep too, like whatever made it was carrying a lot of weight. Bobby knelt down next to it and held his own boot up for comparison. His size 11 looked like a child's shoe next to that thing. We looked around and found 2 more prints heading away from the creek into thick brush. They were spaced out like whatever made them had a stride longer than any person I'd ever seen. We took some pictures with Bobby's phone and marked the spot with some orange surveyor's tape. When we got back to camp, Ken was already there, cleaning a nice 6-pointer he'd taken that morning. We showed him the photos, and his expression changed from pride to confusion. Ken had been hunting longer than both of us combined. He'd seen every kind of track these mountains had to offer. After studying the photos for a few minutes, he shook his head and said he'd never seen anything like it. We spent the rest of the afternoon trying to figure out what could make a print that size. The only thing that came close was a black bear walking on its hind legs. But bear track don't have 5 toes like that. That second night felt different. Maybe it was because of the strange tracks, or maybe because the forest seemed quieter than usual, but none of us slept well. I kept waking up to small sounds, twigs snapping, leaves rustling. The kind of noises that happen all the time in the woods, but somehow seemed louder and more deliberate. Around 2 in the morning, I heard that same grunt I'd noticed the night before, but closer this time. It seemed to come from just outside the circle of light from our dying campfire. I grabbed my flashlight and rifle and stepped outside my tent. Bobby and Ken were already awake. I could see their flashlight beams moving around their tents. I called out quietly to see if they had heard it too. Ken's voice came back tense and low. He'd been hearing movement for the past hour, something big walking around our campsite, staying just far enough away that the flashlights couldn't pick it up. We spent the next 20 minutes listening and watching, but whatever it was had gone quiet. In the morning, we found more tracks. Something had walked a complete circle around our camp during the night, staying about 30 yards out. The footprints were the same as the ones we'd found by the creek, huge, 5-toed, and deep. Whatever had made them was heavy and walking upright. Sunday morning, we packed up our gear and moved camp deeper into the valley. Ken thought we were being watched and wanted to put some distance between us and whatever was making those tracks. We hiked about 2 miles downstream to a spot where the creek made a sharp bend around a steep hillside. It was more isolated than our first camp, but it felt safer somehow. We could see anyone approaching from 3 directions. We spent the morning hunting, but our hearts weren't really in it. The excitement of opening weekend had been replaced by an uneasy feeling that we weren't alone in these woods. Every shadow between the trees made us stop and stare. Every bird call made us reach for our rifles. Around noon, Ken found something that turned our unease into real fear. About a quarter mile from our new campsite, he discovered what looked like a shelter, a crude lean-to made from broken branches and dead logs. It was big enough for something the size of what we'd been tracking, and it looked recently used. The ground around it was packed down hard, and there were bones scattered nearby. Deer bones mostly, but some that looked like they might have come from smaller animals. The smell was what really got to us. It was a mix of rotting meat and something else, something wild and musky that made your nose burn. Ken took some pictures and backed away slowly. When he got back to camp and showed us what he'd found, we decided we'd had enough. We were packing up and heading home. While we were breaking down camp, the noises started. At first, it was just an occasional wood knock, the sound of something hitting tree trunks in a rhythm. Tap, 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 then silence, then tap, tap, tap from a different direction. Ken said he'd heard of this before. Some hunters claimed Bigfoot used wood knocking to communicate over long distances. As we stuffed our gear into our packs, the knocking got closer and more frequent. Soon we were hearing it from all around us, north, south, east, west. It was like we were surrounded. Bobby suggested we try making some noise back, maybe bang on a tree with a stick to show we weren't afraid. Ken and I both told him that was a terrible idea. By the time we had our packs loaded and were ready to move, the wood knocking had stopped. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no insects, no wind in the trees. It was the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring and your skin crawl. We started hiking back toward the truck, moving as fast as we could with heavy packs. We'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes when we heard the first howl. It came from behind us, back toward our old campsite, and it was like nothing I'd ever heard before. Not quite human, not quite animal, but something that raised every hair on the back of my neck. The sound echoed through the valley for what felt like forever. Then we heard an answer, another howl, this one from our left, somewhere up on the ridge, then another from the right. We were being tracked by multiple creatures and they were talking to each other. Ken took point, Bobby brought up the rear, and I stayed in the middle. We picked up the pace, half jogging when the terrain allowed it. Every few minutes we'd hear another howl, always from a different direction, always seeming to get closer. It was clear now that we weren't just being watched, we were being herded. About an hour into our hike, we crested a small rise, and Ken suddenly dropped to one knee, holding up his fist for us to stop. He pointed ahead to a cluster of large boulders about 50 yards away. At first I didn't see anything. Then one of the shadows moved. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall and covered in dark brown hair. It stood upright like a man but had the build of a gorilla with arms that hung almost to its knees and shoulders so broad it looked like it could flip a car. The thing was just standing there watching us, making no attempt to hide. We stared at each other for what felt like an hour but was probably only 30 seconds. Then the creature let out a roar that shook the trees and started walking toward us. Not running, walking, like it knew we couldn't get away and was in no hurry to catch us. All three of us turned and ran. We crashed through the brush, branches tearing at our clothes and packs, not caring about the noise we were making. Behind us, we could hear heavy footsteps and the sound of small trees being pushed aside like they were weeds. We ran for maybe 10 minutes before Bobby stumbled and went down hard. When Ken and I turned back to help him, we saw them, 3 of the creatures, coming through the trees in a line like they were driving us toward something. They moved with purpose, not the random wandering of animals, but like hunters who knew exactly what they were doing. Bobby had twisted his ankle in the fall and couldn't put weight on it. Ken and I grabbed him under the arms and half carried, half dragged him toward a steep section of hillside where we thought we might be able to lose them. The creatures followed at a steady pace, never getting closer but never falling behind either. We reached the base of a cliff and realized we'd made a mistake. There was no way up with Bobby injured, and the creatures had us trapped against the rock face. That's when Ken made the decision that probably saved our lives. He told us to spread out and get ready to fight. I'd brought my grandfather's .30-06, a rifle that had taken more deer than I could count. Ken carried a .308, and Bobby had a 12-gauge shotgun loaded with slugs. Between the 3 of us, we had enough firepower to stop a grizzly bear. We hoped it would be enough for whatever was coming after us. The first creature broke from the tree line about 40 yards away. In the afternoon light, I could see it clearly for the first time. Its face was almost human, but wrong somehow. The jaw too big, the brow too heavy, the eyes too small and set too deep. Its arms were longer than any person's, and its hands ended in thick, black fingers that looked like they could crush bone. Ken fired first. His shot took the creature high in the chest, and it stumbled backward but didn't go down. Instead, it let out a sound I'll never forget. Part roar, part scream, full of rage and pain. The other 2 creatures appeared on either side of the first one, and all 3 of them charged. Bobby's shotgun boomed twice in quick succession. I saw one of the creatures spin and fall, dark blood spattering the leaves behind it. My own rifle kicked against my shoulder as I put a round center mass into the biggest one. It dropped to one knee but kept coming, using its knuckles to pull itself forward like a wounded gorilla. That's when everything went to hell. The wounded creature that Ken had shot reached us first. It grabbed Ken around the waist with one massive arm and lifted him off the ground like he weighed nothing. Ken was screaming and trying to bring his rifle around, but the thing's grip was too strong. I heard his ribs crack like dry wood. I was trying to get a clear shot when the second creature hit me from the side. It felt like being tackled by a refrigerator. I went down hard, my rifle flying into the brush. The creature pinned me to the ground with one hand while it reached for my throat with the other. Its breath was horrible, like rotting meat and wet fur. Up close, its eyes were completely black, with no white showing at all. Bobby was still fighting, working the action on his shotgun and putting rounds into anything that moved. But there were more of them now. I could hear crashing in the brush as others approached. The creature on top of me was too heavy to throw off, and its fingers were closing around my neck. I was starting to see spots when Bobby's shotgun went off right above my head. The blast caught the creature in the side of the skull, and it rolled off me, thrashing and making a sound like a wounded horse. I scrambled away looking for my rifle and saw Ken on the ground 20 feet away. The creature that had grabbed him was still holding his body, shaking it like a rag doll. Ken wasn't moving. Bobby was backing toward the cliff face, his shotgun trained on the tree line. His face was white as paper, and I could see his hands shaking. 2 more creatures emerged from the brush, moving more carefully now that they'd felt our bullets. One of them was dragging its left leg, dark blood matting the fur on its thigh. The wounded creature I'd shot was still alive, still crawling toward us with its one good arm. Bobby put another slug into its head, and it finally stopped moving. But there were still 3 of them left, and Bobby was almost out of ammunition. I found my rifle and worked the bolt, chambering another round. One of the creatures was circling to our left, trying to flank us. I led it like a moving deer and squeezed the trigger. The bullet caught it in the shoulder and spun it around, but it didn't go down. These things were incredibly tough. The creature that had killed Ken dropped his body and turned toward us. Even from 30 yards away, I could see Ken's blood on its hands and chest. It opened its mouth and roared, a sound so loud and deep it seemed to shake the ground under our feet. Then it charged. Bobby's last shot took it square in the chest at 15 yards. The slug knocked it backward, but it kept its feet and kept coming. I put my final round into its head just as it reached us. The impact snapped its neck back and it finally went down. But our celebration lasted about 2 seconds. More howls echoed from the forest around us, not just 1 or 2, but what sounded like a whole pack. We'd killed 3 of them, but there were others, and they were closing in. Bobby grabbed Ken's rifle and what ammunition he could find. I reloaded mine with my last few rounds. We couldn't carry Ken's body, and both of us knew we'd be lucky to get out of there alive ourselves. It was the hardest decision I've ever made, leaving my friend like that, but there was no choice. We started climbing the cliff face, looking for any way up and out of the valley. The rock was loose and crumbly, and with our heavy packs, we could barely make progress. Behind us, we could hear the creatures crashing through the brush, getting closer with every passing minute. About halfway up the cliff, Bobby's pack caught on a ledge and tore open. Half his gear tumbled down onto the rocks below. Food, extra clothes, his sleeping bag. We didn't stop to gather it. We just kept climbing, our hands cut and bleeding from the sharp rock. Near the top of the cliff, I found a narrow ledge that led around the face of the rock toward what looked like a gap in the ridge. It was barely wide enough for one person, with a drop of at least 100 feet to the rocks below. But it was our only option. Bobby went first, his back pressed against the rock wall, sliding sideways inch by inch. I followed, trying not to look down. The ledge was slick with moisture and covered in loose gravel that threatened to give way under our boots. Halfway across, we heard howling from directly below us. When I looked down, I saw 2 of the creatures at the base of the cliff looking up. One of them started climbing. The thing climbed like a spider, finding handholds in rock that looked smooth to me. It moved fast too, covering in minutes what had taken us nearly an hour. I could see its eyes reflecting what little light filtered down from above, and they never left us. We reached the gap in the ridge just as the creature pulled itself over the top of the cliff behind us. Bobby squeezed through first, then me. The opening was tight, just barely wide enough for a person with a pack. As I pulled myself through, I felt massive fingers brush against my boot. I kicked backward as hard as I could and felt my heel connect with something solid. The creature let out a grunt of pain and released its grip. On the other side of the ridge, we found ourselves in a different valley, one neither of us had seen before. The terrain was rougher, full of fallen logs and boulder fields that made walking treacherous. But we had no choice except to keep moving. We could hear the creatures behind us howling to each other across the ridge. We hiked all afternoon, stopping only when we absolutely had to rest. Bobby's ankle was getting worse, the one he'd twisted when we first ran, and he was limping badly. Every step was obviously painful, but he never complained. We both knew that slowing down meant dying. As the sun started to set, we realized we were completely lost. Nothing looked familiar, and the valley seemed to stretch on forever in both directions. Ken had been our navigator, and without him, we were just guessing. We had maybe 2 hours of light left, and the creatures were still following us. We could hear them howling every 20 or 30 minutes, always from behind, always getting closer. We found a small cave in the hillside just as darkness fell. It wasn't much, just a hollow in the rock about 10 feet deep and 6 feet wide, but it gave us shelter for the night. We crawled inside, pulled some dead branches across the opening, and tried to rest. Sleep was impossible. All night long, we heard them moving around outside, heavy footsteps circling our hiding spot, occasionally stopping right at the mouth of the cave. Once, something pushed against the branches we'd piled up, testing them. We sat in the dark with our rifles ready, waiting for them to break through. But they never did. As the first light of dawn crept into the cave, the sounds finally stopped. We waited another hour before moving the branches aside and looking out. There were tracks everywhere in the soft earth around the cave mouth. The same massive 5-toed prints we'd been seeing since yesterday. We had to get out of that valley. Bobby's ankle was swollen to twice its normal size, and we were down to our last few energy bars and a half-empty water bottle. Worse, we were still completely lost. Every ridge looked the same, every valley seemed to lead deeper into the wilderness. We decided to follow the valley downstream, hoping it would eventually lead to a larger creek or river that we could follow back to civilization. It was slow going with Bobby limping, but we made steady progress. For the first few hours, the forest was quiet. No howls, no wood knocking, no sign that we were still being followed. Then, around noon, Bobby spotted movement on the ridge above us. At first, it looked like a black bear walking along the skyline, but when it stopped and turned toward us, we could see it was walking on 2 legs. It stood there for several minutes, just watching us, then disappeared back into the trees. 10 minutes later, we saw another one on the opposite ridge, then another behind us, back the way we'd come. They were tracking us like a pack of wolves, staying high where they could watch our movement while remaining out of rifle range. The harassment started in the early afternoon. They began throwing rocks down at us from the ridges, not trying to hit us directly, but landing close enough to let us know they could. The rocks were big, some the size of footballs, and they hit the ground with enough force to shatter. If one of those had connected with a person, it would have been lights out. We picked up the pace as much as Bobby's ankle would allow, but the creatures picked up theirs too. Soon they were ahead of us, behind us, and on both sides. Every time we looked up at the ridges, we could see dark shapes moving through the trees. They were herding us again, just like they had at the cliff face. Late in the afternoon, the valley began to narrow. The creek ran between 2 steep ridges that rose almost straight up on both sides. It was like walking through a canyon, except with trees and undergrowth instead of bare rock. There was only one way forward and one way back. About halfway through the narrow section, Bobby stopped and grabbed my arm. Ahead of us, maybe 100 yards away, one of the creatures was standing in the middle of the creek. It was the biggest one we'd seen yet, at least 9 feet tall and built like a linebacker. It wasn't moving, just standing there blocking our path. We turned to go back the way we'd come, but there was another one behind us, and this one was carrying what looked like a club, a thick tree branch with the small end broken off. We were trapped between them with steep ridges on both sides and no way to climb out. Ken would have known what to do. Ken would have found a way out of this. But Ken was dead, and it was just me and Bobby with maybe 8 rounds between us, facing creatures that had already proven they could take multiple rifle shots and keep fighting. The one with the club started walking toward us. The one in the creek stayed put, blocking any escape in that direction. We were caught in a pincer movement that showed more intelligence than any animal should possess. Bobby raised his rifle and took aim at the closer target. At 30 yards, even with his hands shaking, it should have been an easy shot. But when he pulled the trigger, nothing happened. The firing pin clicked on an empty chamber. In our panic, he'd forgotten to reload after the fight at the cliff. I still had 3 rounds left. I worked the bolt and put my first shot into the creature's chest. It staggered but kept coming. My second shot hit it in the shoulder and spun it around. My third and final shot took it in the head and it finally went down. But the other one was already moving. It charged up the creek toward us, water splashing around its feet, that massive club raised over its head. Bobby was frantically trying to reload, but his hands were shaking so badly he kept dropping cartridges. When the creature reached us, it swung that club like a baseball bat. Bobby tried to duck, but he was still off balance from his injured ankle. The club caught him across the side of his head with a sound like a melon hitting concrete. He went down instantly and didn't get back up. I don't remember picking up Bobby's rifle. I don't remember running. The next thing I knew, I was crashing through thick brush on the side of the ridge, branches tearing at my clothes, my pack long since abandoned. Behind me, I could hear the creature howling, whether in rage or triumph, I didn't know. I ran until my lungs felt like they were going to burst, then kept running. The ridge was steep and covered in loose rock that shifted under my feet with every step. Twice I went down hard, scraping my hands and knees raw. But I got back up and kept moving. As darkness fell, I found myself in a section of hillside honeycombed with small caves and rock shelters. Most were too shallow to provide real protection, but near the top of a rocky outcrop I found a narrow opening that led back into the mountain. It was just wide enough for me to squeeze through, but no way something the size of those creatures could follow. I crawled back into the cave as far as I could go, maybe 15 feet, until the passage narrowed to the point where I couldn't move forward anymore. There I sat in complete darkness, listening to my own breathing and the sound of my heart hammering in my chest. I don't know how long I waited before I heard them outside. Heavy footsteps moving around the rocky area, pausing at different cave mouths, investigating. Once, a beam of light, moonlight or starlight, was blocked out completely as something large moved past the entrance to my hiding spot. Then I heard scraping sounds, like something being dragged across rock. The sounds got closer to my cave entrance, and I realized with growing horror what was happening. They weren't trying to reach me, they were sealing me in. The scraping continued for what felt like hours. Occasionally, I'd hear grunts of effort, like the sounds humans make when lifting something heavy. Gradually, the faint light that had been filtering in from the cave entrance began to dim. They were piling rocks in front of the opening, building a wall to trap me inside. I crawled forward as far as I could and felt around in the darkness. Where the cave mouth used to be, my hands found only solid rock, a barrier of stones fitted together so tightly that no light could get through. I was sealed in a tomb of my own choosing. Panic hit me like a physical blow. I clawed at the rocks until my fingernails broke and my hands were bleeding, but the stones were too big and too tightly wedged for one person to move. I could hear my own breathing getting faster and more shallow as the reality of my situation set in. I was going to die in this hole in the ground, and no one would ever find my body. I tried to control my breathing and think rationally. The cave extended back maybe 15 feet before it got too narrow to crawl through. The air felt stale but not poisonous. There had to be some kind of ventilation, maybe cracks in the rock that were too small to see. I might have a day or two before the oxygen ran out. My water bottle had been in my pack, which I'd lost during the run up the ridge. I had no food except a half-empty pack of beef jerky in my jacket pocket. No flashlight, no matches, no way to signal for help. Just me and the dark and the growing certainty that I was going to die alone. I spent that first day trying everything I could think of to escape. I felt along every inch of the cave walls, looking for loose rocks or cracks I might be able to widen. I tried digging at the floor with my hands, thinking maybe I could tunnel under the rock wall. Nothing worked. The cave was solid granite, and the barrier blocking the entrance was built to last. The hunger wasn't too bad yet, but the thirst was getting worse. My mouth felt like cotton, and my lips were starting to crack. I tried to ration the spit in my mouth, but there wasn't much of it. Every few hours, I'd suck on the beef jerky for the moisture, but that just made me thirstier. The worst part was the silence. In the complete darkness of the cave, my other senses seemed to get sharper. I could hear my own heartbeat, the sound of air moving in and out of my lungs, even the rumbling of my empty stomach. But from outside, nothing, no wind, no birds, no sign that there was still a world beyond my rocky prison. I tried to stay positive by thinking about my wife and kids, about the things I'd do when I got out of there. But as the hours dragged by, those thoughts got harder to hold on to. More and more, I found myself thinking about Ken and Bobby, wondering if their bodies were still lying where they'd fallen or if the creatures had dragged them away. By the second day, I was getting weak from dehydration. The beef jerky was gone, and my mouth was so dry I could barely swallow. I'd stopped trying to move the rocks. I didn't have the strength left to budge stones that would have been heavy even when I was at full strength. I must have dozed off sometime in the afternoon because I woke to the sound of scraping outside the cave. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming, but then I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of rock against rock, like someone was moving the barrier. Hope flared in my chest. Maybe it was a search party. Maybe someone had found the abandoned campsite and followed our trail. I pressed my ear against the rock wall and listened. The scraping continued for several minutes, then stopped. I waited for a voice, for someone to call out, but there was only silence. Then, suddenly, light began to seep through cracks in the rock wall. Not much, just thin beams of what looked like moonlight. But after more than a day in complete darkness, it was blinding. I heard one final scraping sound, much louder than the others, and then heavy footsteps moving away from the cave entrance. I waited. I don't know how long, maybe an hour, maybe 3. I was too afraid to move, too afraid that whatever had opened the cave was waiting outside for me to emerge. But eventually, thirst won out over fear. I crawled forward and began working at the rocks. The barrier was still there, but it had been partially dismantled. Whoever or whatever had moved the rocks had left a gap just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. I pushed aside the remaining stones and crawled out into the night. The forest was empty, no creatures, no search party, no sign of what had freed me from the cave. Just moonlight filtering through the trees and the sound of wind in the branches. I sat on the rocks outside the cave entrance for several minutes, trying to make sense of what had happened. Why would the creatures that had killed my friends and sealed me in a cave come back to let me out? It made no sense. Maybe it hadn't been them at all. Maybe a bear had knocked some of the rocks loose, or maybe the barrier had just shifted on its own. But the rocks I'd found scattered around the cave entrance were too big and too deliberately placed for that to be the explanation. I was free, but I was still lost in the middle of nowhere with no food, no water, and no idea which direction would lead back to civilization. My rifle was still in the cave, but I was too weak to crawl back in and get it. Even if I had it, I only had 2 rounds left. Not enough to make a difference if the creatures came back. I picked a direction that seemed to lead downhill and started walking. My ankle was twisted from the climb up the cliff, and every step sent pain shooting up my leg. But I had to keep moving. Staying in one place meant dying. For 2 days, I stumbled through the forest, following game trails and creek beds, eating whatever berries I could find and drinking from puddles when it rained. I lost probably 15 pounds in those 2 days, and by the time I reached the Forest Service road, I was barely able to walk. The strange thing was, I never saw or heard the creatures again. No howls, no wood knocking, no massive footprints in the mud. It was like they just vanished, or like they decided I wasn't worth pursuing anymore. Maybe killing Ken and Bobby had been enough for them. Maybe they made their point. A park ranger found me collapsed beside the road on Wednesday morning. I was delirious from dehydration and exposure, mumbling about monsters and caves and dead friends. They got me to a hospital, pumped me full of IV fluids, and called my wife. When I was finally coherent enough to tell my story, nobody believed me. The sheriff listened politely and took notes, but I could see in his eyes that he thought I was suffering from trauma and hypothermia-induced hallucinations. The Park Service launched another search for Ken and Bobby, but they never found their bodies. After a week, the official report listed their deaths as the result of a bear attack. I tried to tell people what really happened. I showed them the photos Bobby had taken of the first footprint we'd found, but digital photos can be faked. I described the creatures in detail, their size, their intelligence, the way they'd hunted us like prey. Most people listened with the kind of polite attention you give to someone who's clearly been through something terrible, but might not be thinking straight. My wife believed me, or at least she said she did. My kids were too young to understand what I was talking about. Friends and neighbors treated me like I'd suffered a breakdown, something they needed to be gentle about, but not necessarily take seriously. The worst part was going to Ken and Bobby's funerals and listening to people talk about the bear attack that had killed them. Their families deserved to know the truth, but what was I supposed to say? That their husbands and fathers had been murdered by creatures that weren't supposed to exist? That the Park Service and the Sheriff's Department were either covering it up or too incompetent to recognize what had really happened? I kept quiet and let people believe what they wanted to believe. It's been 3 years since that hunting trip, and I've had time to research what happened to us. For more interesting stories like this, consider checking this out.